first we're just going to talk about the dynamics of bullying, because it's really important to have this frame of reference before we kind of move on to what you can do about it. And I always like to start to talk about, why do we care about bullying? Obviously we know it hurts our kids, but how does it hurt our kids? There's a staggering statistic that over 160,000 kids stay home from school each day from fear of being bullied. So think about that, 160,000 kids who are missing out on their right to learn because they're scared to go to school because they're being bullied. So that really ties back to, it becomes an educational issue. So if you ever have, if you're ever at your school talking about bullying and they say it's not that big a deal, there's a great stat to quote right there. It is a big deal, and it is an educational issue, and it is about the safety of our kids. And children who are bullied also report more physical symptoms like stomach aches and headaches, and that may or may not be true. Sometimes kids will say, I don't want to go to school because I have a stomach ache. They may or may not have a stomach ache, but in reality they might, but it's probably a physical reaction to being scared, to being sad. And so there's a response to it. And so there's lots of things that statistics show that kids have a loss of self-esteem, self-confidence, there's a decrease in grades, they miss school, obviously, there's truancy. And then, in our media, we've been hearing a lot of stories about kids who have committed suicide because they're being bullied, and so it's being taken to that extreme. So just a definition of bullying, what are the hallmarks? What needs to be present for something to be a bullying situation? And there's really three main elements about it. It has to be intentional. So someone who's walking down a hallway and accidentally bumps into somebody and says, oh, I'm sorry, probably not bullying. But that same scenario, somebody's walking down the hallway, they bump into someone, and they either don't say anything or they give them a look or whatnot, and they're doing it on purpose, that's probably bullying. And you can even say sorry, but if you don't mean it, it's still intentional, because you'll see that a lot with kids. Boys will do that a lot. They'll bump into each other. It's like, sorry, dude, but they're really not sorry. So that intent is there. So there's an intent to hurt or harm. And it has to be a hurtful action. So it has to be something that hurts somebody either emotionally or physically. And we'll go into some more detail about what those can be. And that third one, power imbalance. If you think back to movies and other things that have portrayed bullying, we think about the bully as being the really big kid, the really tall kid who wears all black, bullying the really little kid. But really it's more than that. That's a definite power imbalance of size there. But power imbalance can be much more subtle about that. Somebody who has a lot of social stature, it's a lot easier to bully somebody who doesn't have that same social stature. So kind of think of your cool girls. Your cool girls can bully a lot more than your kids who don't have that same social capital. I remember in one of my focus groups, there was a little girl, she was a second grader, and she was just a little waif. And with my focus groups, I always say, don't tell me who's the bullies, don't tell me who's the kids who are being bullied. I don't want any background on them, I just want a variety of kids. And I had assumed, of course, erroneously, that she was, probably not one of the bullies, but it turned out she was like the school bully. So this little blonde-haired girl, and she was the one who perpetuated most of the behavior. So those are the hallmarks of a bullying situation. And then when we talk about, hurt or harm, that hurt or harm can be done in a number of ways. Verbal is one, and this is the easiest to inflict because it's quick, and you can do it, most kids can do this outside the sight of adults. It's name calling, it's teasing, it's derogatory remarks, it's making somebody feel inferior using words. Social is much more covert, and I like to use the example of middle school girls, because I think middle school girls they can be terrorists. It can be as simple as somebody walking down the hallway, they've got new clothes on and they're thinking, I'm looking pretty good, I'm feeling pretty good, and some girl does this to her. They don't have to say a word. We all know what that means. So bullying, it can be that intent to, and again, that was done intentionally to make that person feel bad about what they were doing. So, social bullying is also about exclusion, leaving people out on purpose. not including people. So social is just as devastating as this next one, physical, which we all recognize as a bullying behavior. But physical can be anything from, the pushing, the shoving, the hitting, the kicking. But it can also be taking somebody's belongings, destroying somebody's belongings too. So anything on their person. Social can be, it can be a glance, a lewd glance, and it can go all the way up to sexual assault. So there's quite a few characteristics, and the newest one, and we've gotten more media attention with this now, but it's the cyberbullying. So what I always like to call, as technology has evolved, which is great and wonderful, so has that ability to bully. And we call cyberbullying, we call it the new bathroom wall. So what used to happen just at school or maybe in the community or maybe in the neighborhood a little bit, all of a sudden kids have this venue to reach out to hundreds, to thousands, and to bully. And because it's not done face to face, it's anonymous, it's much more wicked too. And there's a variety of ways kids are doing it. They're using Facebook, they're taking pictures with cell phones, they're posting videos, they're creating hate lists. Kids are being, unfortunately, very creative using technology. And it's harder to manage. And there's also not a lot of rules right now around cyberbullying. And so it becomes very difficult to how do you address it. This is the first generation who's dealing with cyberbullying. But I also like to say that so much of bullying can be covert and you can't quantify it. You can't quantify a sidelong glance. It's harder, if somebody's being called a name, it's a lot harder to say, well, that can't hurt you. But all of a sudden with cyberbullying, you do have this solid evidence trail of things that are happening. So a lot of times people would say, oh, your kid's not being bullied. If you can bring in their cell phone that has a text message on it and say, look, here it is, it's right here. I've got the hard trail of evidence. Here's something that happened on their Facebook account. All of a sudden, with cyberbullying, as unfortunate as it is, it's one of the few places that it does leave this kind of trail of evidence.
Children with Tourette syndrome are very vulnerable, I think. Up here it says children who are bullied are not victims, they are targets. They do have the power to change what is happening, and I'm going to talk about both those things. Children with Tourette tend to be maybe slightly more immature than a lot of their social peers, and that makes them vulnerable to reactions. And children with Tourette also have some often very easily misunderstood complicated symptoms, their tics, which so many people don't know about. So we need to seriously educate everybody that comes in contact with our children and teach them the advocacy skills so that they can take that on a larger role every year. Children with Tourette tend to have a low self-esteem. Hopefully that gets better and better each year, but many children with Tourette syndrome do have low self-esteem, and so that also makes them a target for bullying.
Also, just statistically, kids, I'm always asked, well, how many kids are bullied? And there's a lot of variance in statistics, and you see a lot of different research, but commonly I would say about 15% of our population, of our kids, are bullied. But you add in having a disability in that factor, and it becomes almost as high as 75 or 80%. So 75 to 80% of kids with disabilities, and this is any disability, are bullied. And there's really, the two primary factors why kids get bullied are social isolation is one of them, and that's just true of so many of our kids with disabilities, because oftentimes they're not going to have a peer group, a large peer group to surround themselves with. It's a lot harder to bully someone who's in a group than someone who's socially isolated or doesn't have another friend or peer to look out for them, to stand up on their behalf. The other reason is the emotional reaction, the vulnerability to it. So kids who bully, bullying is about wanting power and control over a situation, seeking power and control. And the way they feel that they know that they have it is when they get an emotional reaction out of somebody. And that emotional reaction can be getting mad or getting scared or angry or fearful, running away, fighting back. So so often kids, when they do that, when they exhibit that vulnerable behavior, that's when the bullying is very likely to continue and to escalate too.
So children with Tourette that have these sometimes very complicated tics, such as a deep plie or a windmilling of the arms or a loud whooping tic, these are misunderstood. They are not understood within our communities and our society that we live in. They're not as understood as maybe a child in a wheelchair or a child that even has a disfigurement. So I think that our children are sort of ripe as targets, and that's a little concerning.
You know, and that's a really good point too. And a lot of this is about the invisible disabilities. You know, so kids, when they see somebody who's has, for example, Down syndrome or is in a wheelchair or who is deaf and is signing, they're a lot more accepting of that than a behavior that they just don't understand. Say, for example, our kids who have ADHD or OCD or Tourette's. So, you know, a huge part when I find when you talk to kids and you give them information about the disability, they're so much more accepting of it, and they say, I get it, I understand it. You know, but the invisible disabilities are really the ones that become more vulnerable. Why do some kids bully? It goes back to, as I mentioned earlier, it's about that power and control, seeking to have power and control. Oftentimes you'll find that kids who bully have less empathy too for other kids. And, you know, they want to get a reaction out of somebody. You know, there's a lot of kids who bully in response to being bullied too. We call that reactive bullying. And that's, again, a true characteristic of a lot of our kids with disabilities, because they think that that's what they can do in that situation, or they feel that that might be their only recourse. And I think it's interesting for kids with disabilities who bully in response, they're generally the ones who get called out on it. It's not the kid who's bullying them, because oftentimes that kid will have much more social savvy skills, and they'll make it look like, I had nothing to do with it, they did that to me. You know, so that's a big dynamic that goes on. And I always say too, you know, if you have a kid who's younger and for some reason you find out that they're exhibiting bullying behavior, I always encourage parents, you know, a lot of times kids will just test out bullying. You know, maybe they were frustrated that day or whatnot, and they called somebody a name and they got called out on it by the teacher, and now you're talking to you know, the school about it. But really what you want to do when you find that out is give your kid an empathy check. You know, ask them, how do you think that other kid felt about it? If they show remorse about it, chances are they're not going to continue the bullying. You need to give them an education. You need to give them some parameters. But if they're not showing remorse, then you need to take it to the next steps and really talk about how do you, you know, control your anger? How do you, what are some strategies to help you stop bullying? Bullying has been around forever. And you know, but all of a sudden we're just kind of starting to talk about it is because we do finally see some statistics about how it does affect our kids. But why I can say it's been around forever, if you think about these common views about some of the attitudes that we've held as a culture, as a society, and these are some of the things that we have said or heard, you know, to justify the behavior. And it's why it continues, is because we really haven't thought of strategies to address it. We've just have kind of accepted it. We've had this kind of code of silence where you don't talk about it because it's just part of it's part of growing up. In fact, that's one of the things that we say. But the statement, boys will be boys. So two boys fighting out on a playground, well, that's just natural, you know. That's just boys being boys. But again, by saying that, what it does is it shows an acceptance of bullying behavior. It justifies it. Girls don't bully. Well, we all know that isn't true, how I feel about that. I have a 15-year-old right now who's in school, so I feel like a semi-expert on girl bullying at the moment. But girls aren't physically bullying, but they're using that social bullying. They're leaving people out. They're using, you know, texting. They're not including, you know, gossiping about each other. The girls who are friends one day probably aren't friends the next week. You know, you see those triangulations and the relationships move faster than the speed of light. Words will never hurt you. Again, you know, when someone says, well, they called me, you know, this name, And our response has been, well, words will never hurt you. But we know quite the opposite is true. I mean, a lot of you, if you think back to a name that you might have been called in grade school, it sticks with you forever, you know? I know in 5th grade, I think I've been this height since I was in 5th grade, and I was called Moose. And so, you know, being a kid who was kind of always creative, what I did is I thought, well, if they're going to call me Moose, I'm just going to put that on the back of my basketball jersey and call it a day. So, but what I did by doing that is I kind of took away their power in the situation. You're going to call me Moose anyway, so what the heck? I'll have it as on the back of my basketball jersey and just embrace it. It's a natural part of childhood. What's natural about being bullied? Really? You know, I mean, yeah, it may happen enough that it feels natural, but there's nothing that's natural about being bullied. Nobody should have to endure that through their childhood. Some people deserve to be bullied. Again, our kids with disabilities, you know, and I still hear kids say this today because, oh, he's weird. He acts weird. He deserves that. He looks different. He deserves that. And that's just been part of our culture, and we really work with kids to say, not true. Nobody deserves to be bullied. Bullying will make kids tougher.
Make more violent.
Yeah, we know quite the opposite to be true. And 95% of the school shootings that you see perpetuated have, the person has been targeted by bullying, and they felt that that was their only recourse. Probably didn't make them tougher. It was only teasing. Again, it goes back to words will never hurt you. We know they do.